So we had a little bit of a technical difficulty today in the face-to-face class with recording the lecture, and so I'm going to cover in this section what we covered there. So a slightly different format than usual, but we'll be covering the same information. We're in the midst of talking about culture and society in the 19th century, and thinking about the relationships between Christianity and other aspects of culture, and how Christianity influenced that, as well as how things influence Christianity. And today we have a focus more on Christian responses to specific aspects of culture. And really, this is continuing the responses of Christianity to modern society in the 19th century, and some of the challenges that that brought. And we looked at, on Monday, we looked at some of the responses by liberal Protestants with respect to modern life and adopting aspects of popular culture, not popular culture, of modern life and science, and adapting Christianity in response to that. And one of the things that we'll look at as we start here is that not everyone is supportive of this modernistic approach in 19th century Christianity. When we talk about this, of course, we can see that in Protestantism as well, but we'll talk about the liberal, we'll talk about the conservative Protestant response to modernism in the 20th century. And so I want to take a look at some things related to Catholicism. Some Catholics were skeptical of the optimism of the 19th century. And Pius IX, who was Pope in the middle of the 19th century, and the Pope who had the longest reign, was particularly opposed to modern ways of looking at life and Christianity. In 1864, he promulgated the papal document Quanta Cura, and specifically he's concerned with the what he calls the evil opinions and the chief errors of this most unhappy age, is what he's saying. Of course, he's writing in the midst of the Civil War, and all sorts of things are going on in Europe and in Central and South America. But Pius is particularly concerned with the rise of naturalism. This kind of focus on naturalistic explanations for the existence of the world, for human beings. And he's also concerned about the separation of church and state, which was becoming much more prominent there in the 19th century, with the United States kind of leading the way, and then it springing up in other places as well. With the encyclical Quanta Cura, he also released a document known as the Syllabus of Errors. And this syllabus was a collection of a variety of errors, ideological errors that he saw being promoted. And those errors covered all sorts of things: naturalism and pantheism, ideas about nature, ideas about indifferentism, we might say moral relativism or ethical relativism. He was also concerned about socialism and communism at the time, and other issues he addressed regarding errors regarding the rights of the church, of civil society, Christian ethics, marriage, the power of the papacy. All sorts of things were covered in this document. I just want to give you a couple of examples of some of the errors Pius said were going around. One error was the notion that human reason, without a reference whatsoever to God, is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood, and of good and evil. It is law to itself and suffices by its natural force to secure the welfare of men and of nations. So this notion that we've seen before about the abilities of human reason apart from God, well, Pius says this is something in error. This is not true. That the human reason can operate without God, can determine truth without God. Another of the errors, he said, as human reason is placed on the level with religion itself, so theological must be treated in the same manner as philosophical science. Trying to make theology and philosophy on the same wavelength and understand them in the same kind of ways. Third error that he identifies, and again, there's much more than this, so I'm just picking a few out here. The church not only ought never to pass judgment on philosophy, but ought to tolerate the errors of philosophy, leaving it to correct itself. And so the church shouldn't have any sort of comment on philosophical systems, philosophical ideas, and shouldn't even speak out when it thinks it's in error. The fourth error that he pointed to was every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. Not surprising that a Catholic leader would say, there's only one true religion, and so everybody should be following Christianity, specifically Catholicism, and shouldn't be just kind of up for whatever they feel like. And then finally, another error, the ecclesiastical power ought not to exercise its authority without the permission and assent of the government. Well, certainly for Pius, the church should be have authority separate from the government. The government shouldn't try to tell the church what to do, although, of course, Pius would say that the church can tell the government what to do. Just a few of the errors, but you can see here this kind of rejection of a lot of modernistic ideas and things that were formulating around in the 18th and 19th century. While Pius was concerned about modernism infecting the church, a later pope, Leo XIII, was concerned about the influence of American culture on the church. Catholics, as we have seen, faced a lot of opposition in the 19th century in the United States, particularly because of their growth, particularly their growth from immigration. And many Protestants, of course, thought that Catholicism and the American way of life were oppositional to each other. They didn't fit in. Catholicism wasn't something that could that met the ideals of an American way of life. Now, because of the Catholic-Protestant divide, the suspicion that's always been a part of that, especially in Anglo-Protestantism and Catholicism, American Catholics have attempted to accommodate the religious practices to American ways of life, American freedom, independence. We saw a lot of this when we were talking in the 18th century. And with that, many American Catholics have often been very anti-traditional, and in a way that a lot of European Catholics have found disturbing. There's kind of a rejection there of the power of the church hierarchy, the weight of the tradition that is so much a part of Catholic Church history, and so a lot of Europeans have often been suspicious of this. So here we have an American system, and Catholics trying to fit a way in there, and so some Catholics adopted the position that Catholicism was compatible with American culture. The Catholics could support the separation of church and state, could support democracy. Leo XIII, however, didn't see it that way, and so he releases a document called Longiqua Oceani, which stands for the wide expanse of ocean, in Latin for the wide expanse of ocean. And in it, he really objects to this idea of the American way of life being something compatible with Catholicism, or at the very least the height of society that all Catholics should accept. And so he says it would be very erroneous to draw the conclusion that in America is to be sought the type of the most desirable status of the church, or that it would be universally lawful or expedient for state and church to be, as in America, dissevered and divorced, right? And so, he assumes that there's some Catholics who have this notion that America should be a light to the rest of the Catholic Church, and that the Catholic Church should accept what is going on in America. That fact that Catholicity with you is in good condition, nay, is even enjoying prosperous growth, is, and that should be by all means, instead of all means, by all means to be attributed to the fecundity with which God has endowed His church. So some American Catholics were evidently saying, look, the Catholic Church is growing here in the United States. So there's something distinct and useful about the American way of life that others should emulate. And Leo is saying no, it's not about the American situation. It's about what God has placed in the church to do. Look where he says there, in virtue of which, unless men or circumstances interfere, she spontaneously expands and propagates herself. Right? The church naturally will expand. And so this isn't about the American system, it's about the natural growth of the church. But she would bring forth more abundant fruits if, in addition to liberty, she enjoyed the favor of the laws and the patronage of public authority. Right? The growth would be even more if church and state weren't separated like they are in the United States. So here we have this kind of concern with modernism, concern with the Americanism, and the shape of Catholic life. In other aspects of modernism, we see kind of a different outlook. So we have the liberal Protestant outlook, kind of accepting and modifying these things, the Catholic hesitancy to accept some of these things. But there are other aspects of modern culture that a lot of people attempted to respond to in a Christian way. Toward the end of the century, the 19th century, there's some changes taking place in Europe, and especially in the United States, where things are developing because of these modern conditions. In the United States and elsewhere, urbanization, industrialization lead to migration to cities. There's where the jobs are to be found, that's where the opportunities are to be found, and so more and more people going to the cities. The rise of immigration as well also has an impact here. And because many immigrants tended to live in these ethnic enclaves or ethnic ghettos, and so you have the existence of the German towns and the Little Italies and eventually the Chinatowns, right? These places where people of a specific ethnic descent tend to live with each other, tend to want to seek protection in numbers. And so here in modern culture, we have more people going to the cities filling with more people, there's more people from strange places. Often people feared the changes that modernization brought. And some were welcoming of it, but a lot of people feared these changes. And other people just feared the other people that were coming in. Right? It wasn't so much about specific new developments that were fearful, but these people from all over the place and don't know them and what are they doing here and all those kind of things. Now we're also talking about it being a time of breakaway individuals, the entrepreneurs, the heroic individuals, the so-called robber barons, people who amassed these huge fortunes during this time. People with names like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan, Ford. All of them are coming into light in the latter part of the 19th century. And it's also a time of a growing middle class. And capitalism is the order of the day. But on the other hand, there are not a lot of the laws that we take for granted today that would serve as some financial and personal protection. There's no minimum wage. There is no child labor laws. So those kind of protections didn't exist here in the 19th century. And so unfortunately, these robber barons make their wealth on the backs of immigrants and children and women and lower class workers as much as they could. But many of them often tried to place an understanding of who they were, what they were doing, in the context of religion, often specifically Christianity. So some, like Andrew Carnegie, attempted to baptize this capitalist enterprise. So he writes a document, writes an article in 1889 called Wealth. And it's kind of the introduction of some ideas that people refer to as the gospel of wealth. And essentially in this, Carnegie is emphasizing the sacredness of private property, right? That this is an important part of civilization. Civilization depends on private property, free competition, free accumulation of wealth, the kind of governmental regulations that were being advanced. They hinder civilization. They don't make it more fair. They don't make it stronger. Wealth ultimately for Carnegie is a virtue of the struggle for survival. Now, what he's referring here to is kind of what we would think of as taking the ideas of Darwin, right, natural selection, survival of the fittest, which was mostly, focused on the natural world, biology, right, natural selection. Taking those ideas and applying them to society, what becomes known as social Darwinism. And so, there's kind of this looking down on the lower people in the lower classes because they're not as fit for society as others. So, essentially justifying ignoring people. Right? There's no reason to help them because this is ultimately the struggle for survival. But for Carnegie, while he sees this as evidence of success in the struggle for survival, he still believes that the wealthy had a responsibility to help the poor. It shouldn't be this ignorance of the poor, and shouldn't be this, kind of marginalizing the poor. But when you think about using your wealth to help the poor, for Carnegie there were three things that you could do. First was you could leave it to your family when you died. But then you don't know what they're going to do with it. You don't know how they're going to spend it, and whether how they spend it would necessarily be how you spend it. Another thing you could do was just essentially leave it for public use after your death. What we're talking about largely here is taxes, right? The government taking a sizable portion of your estate, if you're very wealthy, and then using it for the common good, building roads or bridges or, providing services, those kind of things. The third thing that Carnegie said you could do with your wealth is be philanthropic, right? Use it for the common good while you are alive. And so there are libraries and cultural institutions, right, that bear the Carnegie name, the Carnegie Hall. Right? He also encouraged the creation of hospitals and other things. Now, certainly some of those institutions would be, like hospitals, would be of benefit to people of all social classes. Excuse me. But the cultural institutions, right, the concert at Carnegie Hall, or even the use of a library, all presupposes the ability to participate in those things, the time and the luxury to participate in those things. And so certainly the poorest of the poor aren't able to enjoy any sort of social benefit, and often, there are other things that they need rather than, a concert at Carnegie Hall. Similar concepts are reflected in the ministry, the sermons of a Baptist preacher named Russell Conwell. One of his most famous sermons, and one that he repeated quite a bit through his ministry, is called Acres of Diamonds. Essentially, the thought behind Acres of Diamonds is that everything that you need to get rich is in your community. This is all there. You just need to open your eyes and see it. Essentially, you can get rich if you try hard enough. And so in Acres of Diamonds, Conwell tells the story of an Arab who is kind of dissatisfied with his life. He wants to buy a diamond mine and then mine the diamonds to get rich. So he sells his house, sells his property, goes out, tries to buy a diamond mine. Everything he tries to find, nothing exists, or he's not able to find anything. Only to discover later that there was a diamond bed underneath the original house, right? And so it was there. You need to just look in your own backyard, so to speak. And Conwell essentially is trying to make this suggestion that not only is it not wrong to be rich, and not only does he suggest that, you can be rich if you try hard enough, it's also your Christian duty to be rich. There is not something pious about poverty for Conwell. You're not closer to God if you're poor. And ultimately, he looked at poverty as some sort of punishment for God, or as, people are poor because of their shortcomings. Sorry. But, this notion that poverty isn't something that should be helped, almost kind of, even though he's a Baptist, kind of a survival of the fittest. But God punishes people with poverty. People fail because of themselves. So why help them out of these situations that God has put them in, or that they have come into themselves? Well, not everybody buys into this idea. Not everybody looks favorably on the economic situations of the latter part of the 19th century. And, here we are going to predominantly focus on the Catholic response in the late 19th century. And when we get into the 20th century, we'll look at some more Catholic response as well as some Protestant response as well. I especially want to pause and talk about the Catholic encyclical Rerum Navarro, which is on the rights and duties of capital and labor. This document, written by Leo XIII, of Lingua Oceani. Hard to get that one out. He also wrote Rerum Navarro, and in it he is addressing problems that he sees in labor, in capitalism, and industrialism. And we're talking now that we're on the decline of the robber barons, and this is the time where more and more people are getting together in labor unions, and ultimately, of course, many of those labor unions striking. Well, Rerum Navarro proceeds with kind of listing out a bunch of working class grievances: long hours, dangerous work. As Leo says, a small group of very rich people have been able to throw upon the masses of poor laborers a yoke that is a little better than slavery itself, right? The people have essentially been made slaves. So how do you solve this problem? Well, Leo recognizes that some people have said the way to solve this inequity in society is socialism. But for Leo, that's not a viable solution. Socialism, is a rejection of private property, but Leo still is of the opinion that private property is very important. The holding of private property is a God-given right for him. And although there are problems with capitalism, it ultimately is something that shouldn't be abandoned. And so instead he wants to see cooperation occur between employers and employees, between church and government, to make the life of working people better. And so he encourages labor unions, he encourages workers' comp, even kind of almost a welfare provisions, as well as regulation and oversight by the government. So, for example, he writes, among the several purposes of a society, one should be to try to arrange for a continuous supply of work at all times and seasons, as well as to create a fund out of which the members may be effectually helped in their needs, not only in the cases of accident, but also in sickness, old age, and distress. Ultimately, Leo here is kind of not really wanting to see a strong revision of capitalism. He wants to see the poor taken care of, but it's rescue, it's rehabilitation of capitalism. It's not dismantling unjust economic institutions. It's seeing if they can be worked with, changed, adapted, and renewed. Now, in one sense, we can ask, why is Leo concerned about this? Well, probably a big part is that those masses under the yoke of the very rich, as he says, are immigrant Catholics under the control of rich Protestants. And that's where all of this is coming from, is this subjugation of Catholic immigrants. Especially in the United States, because of they're immigrants, and so they take the lower class jobs. They're not welcome to do other types of jobs. But there's still, he still has some general ideas that are important for the poor that are not just Catholic. So, for example, he says God seems to lean in favor of those who suffer misfortune. This kind of serves the beginnings of what we'll later call the God's preferential option for the poor.